Imagine this. You're on a long, tiring journey. The road has been rough, your body aches, and all you want is a warm, quiet place to lay your head. You pull into a small roadside inn, expecting a private room with a soft bed and silence. But
instead, the innkeeper leads you to a large bed, already half occupied by strangers. You're simply given a corner of it. Odd? For us, yes. But in the Middle Ages, this would have been completely normal. In fact, it was expected. The idea of privacy, especially in the way we think of it today, as a personal space reserved just for you, is a relatively modern invention. For most of human history, life was communal by necessity. People lived, worked, ate, and even slept together, not just out of cultural norms, but for survival. Let's take a step even further back, to prehistoric times. Early humans lived in tight-knit tribes, often sleeping in close proximity. This wasn't just for bonding, it was practical. Sleeping together kept people warm on cold nights and helped protect against predators. Safety and comfort came from the group, not solitude. Fast forward to the medieval period, and you'll see that this concept hadn't changed much. In fact, communal sleeping arrangements were still the norm, even in inns and homes across Europe. The average peasant family lived in a one-room cottage. There were no separate bedrooms, no privacy. Everyone, parents, children, and sometimes even guests, would sleep together in the same space. Beds, if they had one, were extremely valuable. They were prized family possessions often passed down through generations. If a family was lucky enough to own a bed, it wasn't unusual for everyone to pile into it, or for visiting guests to share it as a gesture of hospitality. And hospitality was serious business. Offering someone a space in your bed wasn't seen as strange or inappropriate, it was considered kind and generous. As you climb the social ladder and look at wealthier medieval families, you do see more material comfort. Better bedding, more blankets, and perhaps a bit more space. But the idea of privacy still hadn't fully taken hold. Even in affluent households, the family bed remained common. Servants, attendants, or children might sleep on pallets, or cots arranged around the main bed all in the same room. This communal lifestyle wasn't just about sleeping arrangements, it reflected a broader way of life. In the Middle Ages, personal life and political life were deeply intertwined. Power operated through families, dynasties, and household structures. Royal courts, for example, were not just centers of governance but of domestic life. Privacy wasn't the goal. Proximity meant influence, loyalty, and protection. The private didn't yet exist as a category separate from the public. What we now think of as personal space simply didn't apply in the same way. The walls we take for granted, today, both physical and social, and we're still centuries away from being built. So, next time you settle into your private room, pull up the covers and enjoy a quiet night to yourself. Remember, not so long ago, a good night's sleep might have meant sharing a bed with total strangers, and being thankful for it. Loyalty, power, and sleep in the medieval world. In the medieval world, sleep wasn't just a biological necessity. It was deeply political. Who you slept near, who shared your room, even who was allowed to sleep in your presence, all of it was woven into a complex web of loyalty, hierarchy, and trust. You see, in the Middle Ages, personal relationships and political structures were nearly inseparable. Loyalty wasn't just spoken. It was performed, displayed, and even embodied in where and how people physically lived and slept. Sleep, in fact, was one of the most intimate and telling areas of medieval life. To truly understand this, imagine the life of a great lord, say William the Conqueror or Richard the Lionheart. From the time they were young boys, their lives were shaped around their political futures. These weren't just royal children. They were heirs to thrones, central figures in dynasties, destined to lead armies and shape the fate of kingdoms. Because of their status, they were surrounded, almost from birth, by other boys of noble birth, young aristocrats from powerful families. These weren't casual companions. These were the foundations of their future power base. Young men who would grow up alongside them, train with them, fight beside them, and become their most trusted knights and retainers. They were a circle of loyalty, forged in youth and meant to last a lifetime, and one of the deepest expressions of that loyalty was proximity, including during sleep. In the earliest medieval castles, the center of life was the Great Hall, a large open space within the fortified walls. This hall wasn't just a dining area or a courtroom. It was where the lord lived, conducted politics, and often where he slept. And he wasn't sleeping alone. Retainers, bodyguards, and trusted attendants often slept in the same hall, sometimes on the floor, sometimes on benches or mats, close to their lord. This arrangement wasn't seen as inconvenient or strange. It was a visible reminder of the Lord's power, his inner circle, and the men who pledged their lives to protect him. The mere act of sharing sleeping quarters reinforced these bonds: loyalty while waking, loyalty even in sleep. As castles became more architecturally advanced in the 11th and 12th centuries, we begin to see the development of more private spaces. Above the Great Hall, a new kind of room emerged, the solar. This was essentially the lord and lady's bedchamber, often the only true bedroom in the entire castle. But even this wasn't entirely private by modern standards. While the lord and lady might sleep together in a bed, they were still likely surrounded by attendants, handmaids, or bodyguards sleeping nearby. Total isolation was rare. This is also when we begin to see the introduction of bed hangings or curtains, not just for warmth but for modesty and a measure of privacy within a room full of people. These heavy drapes could be drawn around the bed to provide at least the illusion of seclusion, a small bubble of privacy in a very communal world. It's important to remember that trust and loyalty in the medieval world were deeply physical realities. To sleep in someone's presence, especially a person of high status, meant that you were trusted and that your loyalty had been proven. It meant you were part of their intimate circle, not just emotionally or politically, but literally, spatially. The architecture of castles, the social rituals of feasting, and even where someone laid their head at night were all reflections of medieval power. The people who surrounded a lord, while awake or asleep, told you everything you needed to know about his alliances, his status, and his influence. So next time you think of the medieval world, don't just picture armor and battles. Picture a stone hall at night, lit dimly by the last embers of the fire, filled with the soft sound of sleeping men. Men who had pledged loyalty not just in battle, but in the very way they lived, moved, and slept beside their lord. Sleep, loyalty, and power, the bedchambers of the Middle Ages. When we think about medieval castles, kings, and knights, we often imagine the grandeur of court life, the brutality of battle, and the rituals of power. But to truly understand medieval society, we need to step into one of its most overlooked, yet deeply political, spaces, the bedroom. In the Middle Ages, sleeping arrangements were never just about rest. They were social statements, expressions of loyalty, trust, hierarchy, and protection. Who you slept near, what you slept on, and even where you were allowed to sleep reflected your place in the medieval world. Let's begin with the Great Hall, the heart of any early medieval castle or manor. This enormous communal space served many purposes. It was the dining hall, the courtroom, the seat of political discussion. And yes, at night, it transformed into a massive dormitory. The great lord's closest followers, knights and retainers, would sleep here, often right there on the stone floor or on simple wooden pallets. Over time, these pallets were upgraded with ticks, the medieval word for a mattress. But not all ticks were equal. The poorest ticks were stuffed with straw, dry and crinkly. A step above were ticks filled with wool, offering more warmth and softness. At the highest end, reserved for the nobility, were feather-filled mattresses, the softest and warmest of all, a luxury. As the years went on, nighttime in the Great Hall became more organized. Wooden partitions or heavy curtains were used to divide the space, providing a semblance of privacy. These divisions might be based on rank, purpose, or trusted status. But even with these modifications, the concept of private bedrooms was still alien to most medieval minds. And this wasn't due to a lack of architectural ability. Medieval builders were more than capable of creating private rooms. The technology and materials were available, but the idea of needing personal space or sleeping alone simply didn't occur to them. It wasn't culturally necessary. Privacy, as we know it, was not yet a social priority. If you were a young unmarried knight, you didn't get your own room. You slept in the hall of your lord, near him under his protection, and as a symbol of your loyalty. Your proximity to power was both literal and symbolic. Even as castles evolved in the 12th and 13th centuries and more rooms were added, the private bedroom remained rare. Typically, only the lord and lady of the castle had a private sleeping chamber, known as the solar, usually located above the Great Hall. And even that private room wasn't always exclusive. Inside the solar, the noble couple might sleep on an elevated bed surrounded by curtains or bed hangings, offering some modest privacy. Yet servants or guards often slept nearby within the same chamber, ready to attend them during the night. This arrangement explains the rise of canopy beds with thick drapes, not just as status symbols but as a practical response to constant communal presence. What's fascinating is that these bedchambers weren't just for sleep. They were spaces of statecraft. Take, for instance, Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. According to the biography written by his confidant, Jean de Joinville, the king would gather his closest men around him while sitting on the edge of his bed. These weren't casual visits. These were important political meetings, moments of council, laughter, planning, and debate. His knights, barons, and noble allies would sit cross-legged on the floor around him, listening, advising, sharing riddles, jokes, and serious discussions. The bedchamber was not separate from power. It was a place of power. And sitting on the floor? That was nothing strange. In the medieval West, most people sat on stools or benches. Luxury couches and elaborate furniture were rare, more common in the East. Chairs with backs were reserved for people of high status, while others would sit on rush-covered stone or wooden flooring without complaint. Humility, hierarchy, and function shaped posture just as much as beds shaped rank. Nowhere is the political importance of sleep more vividly illustrated than in the early life of William the Conqueror. When William was just a child, he inherited the Duchy of Normandy. After his father's death, in the late 12th century, there was a moment that startled King Henry II of England. He learned that his son, Prince Richard, later known as Richard the Lionheart, had been sharing a bed with none other than King Philip II of France. Now, to modern ears, this might sound salacious or suspicious, but Henry's alarm had nothing to do with any suggestion of a sexual relationship. His concern was political. In the medieval world, sharing a bed was a potent symbol, not of intimacy in the modern romantic sense, but of deep trust, alliance, and mutual loyalty. For aristocrats, especially knights and rulers, sharing a bed was a visible expression of a political pact. It indicated closeness, cooperation, and a willingness to stand beside one another in matters of war, governance, and loyalty. In Henry's eyes, Richard sharing a bed with Philip meant that Richard was forging a dangerously close bond with a potential rival power, perhaps even plotting against his own father. This practice of communal or shared sleeping among nobles and their retainers wasn't unusual at the time. It was part of a broader cultural and social norm in medieval Europe, where privacy, especially the kind we associate with modern bedrooms, was virtually non-existent. The idea that one might desire a private room simply to be alone, to think, to sleep, or to relax didn't exist as a social priority. Space was communal, life was communal, and sleep too was communal. In fact, the modern concept of a bedroom, a private space reserved for one person or a couple, where one might retreat from the world, is a relatively recent development. In the Middle Ages, people didn't conceive of personal space the way we do today. The notion of individual solitude as a daily right or emotional necessity simply wasn't present. People lived in close quarters with family, servants, and retainers. Even in castles, the layout emphasized public function over private retreat. For instance, the Great Hall of a castle was the heart of the residence. It was where the lord feasted, held court, settled disputes, and yes, slept. The lord's bed was often located in this hall, surrounded at night by retainers who slept on pallettes or simple mattresses, called ticks, laid on the floor. These mattresses ranged in quality. The poorest were filled with straw, middle-tier ones with wool, and the best with feathers. Wealth signaled itself through the quality of one's tick. Even when castles evolved architecturally and began to include solars, upper-floor rooms designated for the lord and lady, these spaces were still rarely private by modern standards. Servants would often sleep nearby, even inside the solar, to be on hand if needed. Heavy bed curtains, often luxurious and ornate, were used not just for warmth, but to provide a semblance of privacy in rooms that were rarely empty. The communal nature of sleep also extended to political function. Important decisions, military strategies, and discussions often happened in the bedchamber. A famous example comes from the Life of St. Louis by John of Joinville, in which he recounts how King Louis IX of France would gather his advisors around his bed at night. The king would sit on the edge of his bed while his knights and officials sat cross-legged on the floor, listening, debating, and sharing stories. These meetings were not just about business. They were bonding rituals that reinforced unity, hierarchy, and collective identity. Interestingly, sitting on the floor wasn't considered lowly or uncomfortable by default. In Western Europe, chairs and stools were certainly used, but floor seating was common and culturally accepted. In contrast, in the Eastern world, luxurious lounges and cushions were more widely used, giving rise to a very different sense of comfort and status. The constant closeness of medieval life had benefits we might underestimate today. People were rarely alone, which meant they were deeply embedded in community and hierarchy. Emotional isolation, the kind many people struggle with today in the digital age, was practically unheard of. If someone did choose to withdraw from society, say to live as a hermit or religious ascetic, it was seen as a profound and even shocking act. Such individuals were regarded with awe, as it was believed that only someone exceptionally holy or spiritually advanced could live without human company. We can also consider the example of King Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile. Like many medieval monarchs, he was constantly on the move. Royal power was itinerant, not stationary. He would travel from city to city, castle to castle, handling governance directly and ensuring loyalty through his presence. His court, including knights, officials, and household staff, traveled with him. They often lodged in cramped fortified castles where space was limited, and sleeping arrangements were basic. The focus wasn't comfort, it was protection, mobility, and presence. Visiting a medieval castle today, especially one from the 11th or 12th century, can surprise modern visitors. These structures are often small and stark compared to the fairy tale castles of later periods, yet they were practical, defensive, and symbolic of power. Their cramped quarters and lack of personal space reflect a world where physical proximity equated to political closeness and social cohesion. In all, the way medieval people slept, together communally in shared